Let's be consistent.
Welcome to the Key to Consistency podcast. I am your host, Rakia Collins, and on today's episode, we're going to be exploring where anger comes from and what role does consistency play in helping us manage our anger. This is, I'd say, a pretty personal podcast episode for me because anger is something that I have struggled with for a good bit of my life. And so I'm going to just go ahead and dive right into it. And so hopefully, the content that we cover today helps someone in managing their anger and being more consistent in their efforts to manage their anger. So, of course, first and foremost, we're going to start off with defining what anger is, right? And that may be pretty basic to some people, like we know what anger is, but you'll be surprised how many people know how to express it physically, but they don't mentally understand kind of what they're going through. So, anger is an emotion that is characterized by antagonism towards someone or something that you feel has deliberately done you wrong, right? And so there is generally a trigger, if you will, that puts most of us in a headspace of being angry. Anger is generally not something that we just wake up and feel angry. Anger is generally the result of something happening, right? So there is generally three stages to anger. So the first stage that we're going to discuss today is going to be escalation, right? So at this escalation stage, we are receiving those cues that in our mind and in our body really resonate with us that, okay, I'm feeling away, right? As we say today, I'm starting to feel away, right? And so that's what happens during that escalation phase. How this generally manifests itself is physically, you may start to, breathe angry. You may feel internally that your heart begins to race. From a behavioral perspective, you may find that you're clenching your teeth. Emotionally, you may find that you feel guilt depending on the reason why you're getting angry. And then cognitively, of course, in our minds, we have imagery of revenge. And so, as I go through and define these three phases, I do want to give you guys what anger looks like for me. And again, this will be a pretty personal episode this time around, but I used to consistently struggle with anger in my relationships, my personal relationships, specifically with the men that I was dating. And so if we're focusing on escalation at this point, it could be as simple as me getting a text message and me feeling like this particular individual has done something to trigger me. They've said something smart, they've made a remark, and now I am feeling escalation, right? So, what does that look like for me? For me, escalation is my heart begins to race and I truly begin to feel something bubble up inside of me, right? I can't necessarily say that I relate to the clenching of the teeth or the feelings of guilt. I personally do not feel those things. I do relate to the images of revenge though. Like, I'm already coming for you. I'm already typing up my text message to get back at whatever you stated. Right. So that's the first stage that I wanted to chat through with you guys. The second phase is going to be expression. Right? So if we stay in that escalation phase for a long time, and we don't attend to what we have to in that particular phase, we will soon find ourselves in the expression phase, right? So this is characterized by a display of anger. So at this point, it's no longer that internal, like escalation, as I mentioned, is, cognitive, it's emotional, it's physical, in the sense that it's things you're doing to yourself, whether you are physically breathing heavily, whether you are clenching your teeth. It's more of those internal type of things versus expression is I am about to express this. So in my case, it would come across as I am about to shoot off this text message. I have typed it out with the intent of getting back at you for what you've stated to me, right? I've typed it out with all of the anger that I can muster in this particular moment. And it may not be, as it is in my example, a text message. Some people may, unfortunately, struggle with physical aggression and physically lashing out at people when they hit this expression phase. And then this last one here that we're going to discuss is going to be post expression, right? And this is where we often find ourselves, where once we've done what we've done during that expression phase, we begin to realize the negative consequences of what we've done. This could be, again, a wide variety of emotions. It could be guilt or shame or regret, or you could be pleased with yourself, right? I'm not gonna make it seem as if all of us are, in a stage of regret, because sometimes when you're angry, you feel like my actions and what I did and what I said to this particular person was well deserved, and they deserved exactly what they got. So I'm not going to pretend that we're all going to be in the same boat, because we may not, right? But I think that one thing we can all relate to, irrespective of how we feel, is the fact that we feel a way after we express our anger. Whether you feel more positive or whether you feel negatively, you do feel a way. And what I just walked you guys through, just so you know, it is not me. I did not come up with that. I actually got that from the American Psychological Association. They refer to those as the 3 stages of anger. And so when you think about the way that you express your anger, if I were to go back to my example of post expression, I do generally feel guilt and shame and regret, because as you can tell if you've listened to this podcast for any amount of time, I end every episode with a Bible verse, and that is because I really do strive to align myself with the teachings of Jesus. And I know that while he allows us to be angry, the Bible says, do not let the sun go down with us feeling that way. And I have allowed anger to resonate and sit with me and build up a home with me, to the point where that is or I should say was my reaction for years. And by years, I mean decades. It really took conscious effort to understand that anger is an emotion. And for me, the way I had to catch myself, because I'm not going to say that, hey, I don't go through this cycle again. Like, this cycle is still real for me. But I'd say the biggest difference between now and then is that now I catch myself when I'm in that escalation stage. I recognize my cues, especially because for me, the building up of anger inside of me is probably the realest thing that I can relate to. I genuinely feel something rising up on the inside of me because I'm getting angry, right? And so for me, one actionable thing that I've done to help with my anger is to constantly practice emotional self-awareness, right? To recognize, okay, Rakia, you are starting to feel away. You are starting to feel angry. right? And how do you cope with this when you feel angry? Well, you can go for a walk. You can begin deep breathing. You can practice mindfulness. You can do a lot of things that help you better regulate your emotions, especially when you're feeling angry. But I also really want to say, going back to my example about my anger coming out in a relationship, is that it's not always just you, right? When you're in a relationship with someone, especially someone on a personal level, they know your triggers, and they over time begin to know what to say and to do to intentionally trigger you, right? So it's like, what do you do when you're in a situation where someone you love and care about is intentionally triggering you, not because they're bad people, but because they want you to feel how they feel. And unfortunately, that is the reality of most humans. When they get triggered, they don't know how to de-escalate themselves. And so they begin to escalate the situation by wanting someone else to be on that same emotional wave with them, which is why emotional self-awareness is so critical, because that is not something that you can I don't want to use the word train, but that is not something that you can assist someone with in terms of helping them get over their anger, right? In any given moment. Most times, as mentioned in those 3 stages, it's not in the expression phase that we go through and we truly sit and we reflect. It's in the post-expression phase, which oftentimes it's too late, because you've either said what you've said. If you're a hitter, you've already done the physical act of putting your hands on someone or throwing something. And so oftentimes the post-expression phase is too late. And so that's why I am encouraging all of us to understand, what gets us escalated, what even gets us angry. Because if you can stop yourself when you're in that escalation phase, whether you again begin to deep breathe, whether you practice mindfulness, whether if you're communicating with your partner, just be honest with them and say, hey, I'm getting angry. I need a 5-minute break, right? And while that person may not be receptive of pausing the conversation, it is important that they do so, right? Especially if this is something that you guys have struggled with together in the past, and this person knows, okay, when he or she gets angry, they go off a cliff when they get really angry. And so really making sure that, you express these things to your partner before anger even happens, right? When you are okay with your partner, when you guys are even keel, when there's no issue going on, I would encourage you to talk about something like this, right? And I know it's not the easiest conversation to have over dinner, right? To say, hey babe, let's talk about my anger issues. Let's talk about it. But I think if you care enough about that person, right, and you want to have a long lasting, successful, healthy relationship with them, this is not going to guarantee that, but I promise you, you will not end with that person because of anger, because you've done the deep work. And when you communicate with that person, when you guys are not in an angry mode, it makes it more likely that when you guys are not angry with one another, they'll hear you out when you say, hey, now I'm angry because we talked about this before, I need a 5-minute break. And it's more likely that this person in that heated moment will say, you know what, we did talk about this, we did agree to this. Irrespective of how I'm feeling, my partner is telling me that they need time to themselves to de-escalate and to reflect, right? And who doesn't want that? Right? Who doesn't want a happy, more successful relationship? And while I've been talking about this through the lens of a romantic relationship, let's be clear. Anger occurs in friendships, it occurs in families, it occurs in any relationship that you have with another being. You have the potential to be angry with them. And so hopefully cultivating that self-awareness, being able to identify your own triggers, being able to understand your patterns is going to help you when you think about, how you can better manage your anger. This episode is sponsored by yours truly, Rakia Collins. And if you need to be reminded to stay consistent throughout your entire day, there's no better way to do that than to have visual cues throughout your day, right? And for those visual cues, visit our merch shop. We have phone cases that remind you to be consistent. We have coffee mugs that remind you about the importance of consistency. And so visit our site at thekeytoconsistency.com. And I hope you enjoy the rest of this episode. So, the next topic that I want us to get into today is going to be how we can use consistency to make sure that we have a better relationship with our anger. And I want to focus on this through the lens of consistency in communication. And I know in the previous topic, I gave you guys I gave you guys communication with a partner. But this is going to be communication with yourself, right? This is going to be you yourself understanding and expressing to yourself your concerns and your needs and your boundaries, right? And I know that those are all things that you could say, well, Rakia, we should also express those things to the other party as well. And you would be 1,000% correct. But if you yourself don't know your concerns, if you don't know what you need, and if you don't have boundaries with yourself, there's no way you can clearly articulate that to another person. Right? And so when you begin to have these conversations with yourself, it honestly reduces the likelihood of anger bottling up and escalating and having those explosive outbursts because you've done the groundwork of communicating with yourself. And I want to dig a bit deeper into this, and I would encourage all of you guys to look up the emotional iceberg or the anger iceberg. If you just do a quick Google search, you will see an iceberg that shows at the very top, which is the tip of the iceberg, it shows anger, right? But then below the waters, where the vast majority of the iceberg is, this is where we see other types of emotion. This is where we see shame, frustration, insecurity, anxiety, stress, guilt, contempt, hurt, right? We see all these other emotions. And the importance of that is when you communicate with yourself and you begin to self-reflect and you understand your own patterns and your own triggers, you can go beyond anger. And the moment that you go beyond anger with yourself, it honestly changes the game, right? So I can give you guys a personal example for me. I remember in my current relationship, I again struggle with anger, and so I used to struggle with anger so bad. And in this particular relationship, I've been with my boyfriend for almost like 5-6 years at this point. And so I used to be angry a lot with him when he would say certain things to me, but I would realize that it wasn't anger I was really feeling. I was really hurt, right? But nobody wants to say, hey, what you just said hurt my feelings, right? Because I don't know about you, but my thing is I'm not a punk. Like you're not going to punk me. I am not a punk. You are not going to say something to me and I'm going to just respond and say, oh, that hurt my feelings. Like, no, I'm going to tell you that I am angry and that what you said pissed me off. Like, I am going to use those type of terms, but it really wasn't until, again, in that third stage of anger, I would always reflect. And in that reflection, one day I decided, you know what, let's really talk this out, right? Like, let's really look at the patterns of when you get angry. And when I looked at those patterns, I began to realize that your anger most of the time comes from hurt. It doesn't come from, really being angry. And so when you enhance your communication with yourself, you know now, okay, great, because I know that I'm experiencing anger with myself. I can now move to express that to my partner in the moment. And when I began to do that with my partner, it changed the game because I was no longer yelling and getting annoyed, especially if we were having an issue in person. My vocabulary began to change. And I began to say things like, well, I was frustrated because you said X, Y, and Z, and this was my interpretation of what you stated, right? And so now I'm not coming at the situation with the easy button. Anger is the easy button, right? But if you look at that iceberg, because I'm assuming that you've already Googled it, right? You'll see all those other emotions are harder to articulate. And that is the reason why they are below the surface. Because as we can see, anger is just the easy button, but anger is really fueled by different types of emotions. And so I would encourage you, once you've had that dialogue internally with yourself and you understand how you are truly feeling, then you can use those same terms when you're communicating with someone else. It really allows you to become an active listener, because when you experience a certain level of vulnerability, which is what it is, right, with yourself and with someone that you love and trust enough to be vulnerable with, then you guys can engage in effective problem solving and really allow your relationship to go to another level. And so the last thing that I want to, of course, talk through with you guys is going to be how we can use consistency in anger management, right? And so anger management, if you love someone or if you yourself or if you just know someone who deals with anger management, it takes a long time to get better with your anger, especially if it's something that this person has been dealing with for decades. It is not an easy fix by any stretch of the imagination. I would encourage therapy. I would encourage consistently practicing those relaxation techniques. Again, whether it's mindfulness, whether you decide to go into yoga, whatever you decide to do that is going to be a healthy coping mechanism for when you feel that escalation arising, that is really what you should practice and really how you can get better with your anger management. I would also encourage you, again, kind of going back to my own story, one thing that I realized I was doing consistently was using the word I, right? I had to recognize that I focused statements really kept me locked into thinking about things through my own lens. I would say things like, well, I'm right because, I said this and you said this. And it's really interesting when you think about the word I in a situation in this particular context of anger, because when you hold on to your beliefs of I, that really causes separation and disharmony when you should be focusing on we and us and those type of empowering statements, right? And so I would encourage you to, make sure that you educate yourself about anger management. You're not getting this education for yourself, but you're getting this education for someone else, making sure that, you run all of these items by them as well, right? Have them listen to this podcast, play it in the car with them, right? Like, hey, I found this cool new podcast, even if you just play this one episode, right? Just making sure that, because anger impacts all of us in different ways, we want to make sure that we are setting up the ones that we love for success. I would encourage you to make sure that outside of, mindfulness and deep breathing exercises, physical activity can also help with anger. Sometimes it just takes going for a walk, you know? Maybe you want to go for a walk by yourself, maybe you want to walk the dog, right? Whatever that looks like for you, as long as the way you cope with anger is positive and it's not self-destructive, it's not going to lead to any negative habits down the line, I would highly, highly, highly encourage you to take advantage of some of those healthy coping mechanisms. And so, as always, guys, I do want to end today's episode with a Bible verse. And so this verse comes from Proverbs chapter 14, verse 29. Whoever is patient has great understanding, but one who is quick tempered displays folly. And I know that none of us are fools. Remember, guys, consistency breeds mastery and transforms the ordinary into the extraordinary. And until next time, bye, guys. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of The Key to Consistency. We'd love for you to review this podcast wherever you are listening to it. Please feel free to follow us on Instagram at thekeytoconsistency.com. And if you enjoyed this episode and you found something that was beneficial to you, of course, please share it with a friend and someone else that you think would benefit from starting their own consistency journey.